Good morning and welcome to Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Fress and I'll be your host for the next hour. You're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.net. Thanks for tuning in. We'll continue now where we left off Friday in the book The Footprints of the Jesuits by R.W. Thompson. Remember, we were speaking about the so-called angelic teachings of Thomas Aquinas. They call him the Great Doctor. I call him the Great Demon of the Roman Catholic Church. And nonetheless, the papacy and the Jesuits have adopted his philosophies and teachings. And one of those philosophies and teachings was that no civil law in any country of the world is valid if it impinges upon the rights of the Pope. The Pope and the Pope alone is the judge and the judge of all law. In other words, if any law of any nation in the world encroaches upon the rights or the jurisdiction of the Pope, either his spiritual or his temporal power, those laws are not binding upon the conscience and may be disregarded whenever expedient until those laws can be overthrown. And if required, the government under which those laws are written is overthrown. Now, beginning in the first full paragraph on page 414 of the book, about halfway down the page, it says, applied practically, this papal and Jesuit doctrine amounts to this under our civil institutions, that one who has taken an oath of allegiance to our government is justified in not feeling under any obligation to obey the Constitution and the laws in their American sense and spirit, but only insofar as they comport with the ulterior purpose to violate both to whatsoever extent their principles shall conflict with the divine law as defined by the Pope. The proposition is easily illustrated. The Constitution confides to the Supreme Court of the United States the duty and authority to decide upon the validity of all of our laws when they are alleged to be invalid. That tribunal, the Supreme Court, has, ever since the beginning of our government, recognized church and state as separated and absolute freedom of religious belief, and the people as the sovereign source of political power, all of which is obedient to the Constitution. Anything to the contrary would undoubtedly be a step in the direction of upturning the government and putting an end to our republic. Yet this Jesuit doctrine, derived from the theological principles of Thomas Aquinas, which we are told are quote-unquote revealed truth, in other words, Thomas Aquinas got this directly from heaven, not only authorizes but encourages as Christian duty an appeal from the Supreme Court to the Pope, and obedience to the latter, that is the Pope, instead of the former, the Supreme Court. Now, Pope Leo XIII, Pope Pius IX, and Gregory XVI in our own time, at the time of the writing of this book, and many other popes before them have decided, and the former holds himself in readiness to repeat the decision whenever necessary, that the government has no rightful jurisdiction over matters which concern the Church or the papacy, whether that jurisdiction is conferred by the Constitution or by fundamental laws, but that they are exclusively within the circle of the Pope's spiritual jurisdiction. Upon the authority of this doctrine, therefore, Pope Leo XIII, with the Jesuits at his back, proposed to obtain the mastery over the people by reversing the decisions of our Supreme Court, and interferes with the working of our government to the extent of instructing citizens of the United States that disobedience to certain of our fundamental laws, as the Supreme Court has interpreted and the people understand them, is an absolute religious obligation, and that obedience to him, the Pope, is the service of God. R.W. Thompson is clearly telling us that there are laws in our Constitution, laws and liberties in our Constitution that are violative of the papal prerogative, and it will be, if Roman Catholicism can succeed, it will be the duty of the Supreme Court to overturn the Constitution or reinterpret the Constitution in favor of the Pope. And we have, for the first time in our nation's history, a supermajority of Roman Catholics on the Supreme Court, with only 3 Jews and absolutely no Protestants whatsoever on the court. And it's just up to my listeners to understand the significance of that. We're seeing this New World Order come into place, and it is not a coincidence whatsoever that the Supreme Court is dominated by Roman Catholics without any Protestant check whatsoever. And I see coming out of this a union of church and state, that Roman Catholicism will become the state religion. I believe it is already, simply because it's not opposed by Protestantism anymore. And Rome will have her sway. And what will result from that eventually, and as is already beginning to take place, religious persecution against non-Catholics, as we see in the case of the Waco tragedy, the Waco Inquisition, and also the Inquisition against Tony Alamo Christian Ministries, and many others that I am not as nearly familiar with. But it's taking place in the United States of America. Any religious group that separates itself from the canonical evangeli-belly churches or the Roman Catholic Church and wants to live a life according to the Scriptures under their own governments are going to be persecuted by the federal government of the United States, because it's controlled by Rome, and Rome sees these organizations as, well, rebellious against the Pope's spiritual and temporal power. He regards them as heretics, and they have no rights because of that. Roman Catholic canon law says it is not a sin to kill heretics. It is not a sin to confiscate their property, such as being done against Tony Alamo Christian Ministries right now. And the government is indeed, in that case, the agent of the papacy. First of all, the state government of Arkansas, together with the federal government, have completely overthrown that Christian ministry. And not only that, they've imprisoned their falsely accused pastor, and now are confiscating the church's property and leaving the residents of that community homeless. It's an atrocity taking place right here in once Protestant USA, and there's no protest against it. It literally goes on under a cloak of secrecy and darkness, in the guise of protecting some innocent people involved, when in fact it is just a crime that's being committed by the federal government against a non-Catholic, and one would even rightly call it an anti-Catholic ministry, because it exposes the history of the papacy. It has historically throughout its existence. But we're talking about not just the overthrow of one sect of Christians. We're talking about the overthrow of our Constitution and all of our Protestant liberties and all of our Protestant institutions. He says, with entire unanimity, the framers of the government of the United States separated church and state and made that central and controlling among the principles which underlie it. But Pope Leo XIII solemnly avers from his pontifical throne in Rome that this violates the divine law and is such libertinism, as he calls it, as is leading society to ruin. Thus he brings himself in direct conflict with our institutions, which would inevitably topple and fall if he were obeyed and his principles were substituted for ours. And in order to secure the object he seeks after, he has commanded that the doctrines of Thomas Aquinas shall be taught as, quote-unquote, revealed truths in all Roman Catholic colleges and schools. You can assume that that's taking place most prolifically in the Jesuit colleges and universities and schools, so that the children of all the Roman Catholic citizens of this country shall be so educated as to be prepared for the union of church and state, and the subordination of the latter, that is the state, to the former, the Roman Catholic Church, whenever prudence shall warrant him or his successors in commanding it. Again, I believe prudence, the day of prudence has passed, and now Rome is free to do exactly what the popes and the Jesuits and Thomas Aquinas and Roman Catholic canon law dictates. That the government of the United States is not a Roman Catholic government, and therefore it may be rightfully at any time, whenever it is an opportune time, least damaging to the Roman Catholic Church, to overthrow it. And now, post-Vatican Council II and ecumenism, that day has arrived, and it's taking place right before our very eyes. Now he continues, he says, if this does not propose to erect an alien and antagonistic government within ours, upon the principle that, quote, the church, that is the Roman Catholic Church, is not in the state, but the state is in the church, unquote, it would require the introduction into our language of a new set of words to tell its meaning, that it makes religion the pretext for gradually undermining our quote-unquote civil institutions. I would call them Protestant civil institutions. Any man can see who has intelligence enough to travel away from home without an attendant. Those engaged in this work, no matter who they are or where, are the sappers and miners of an aggressive army. All right, this is a phrase that is not used much anymore, and I'll explain. Sappers and miners is now become archaic, but it was a way of describing what we would recognize today as a fifth column. You would see in the CIA sappers and miners in foreign nations where they infiltrate and make allegiances with dissidents within the government to form an opposition within that government or nation in order to prepare for its overthrow. That is what we would call a fifth column today, and in the language of the 1880s, during the time of the writing of this book, they were referred to as sappers and miners. Now it says, thus engaged in this work, no matter who they are or where, are the sappers and miners of an aggressive army, a fifth column. At the command of the Pope and Jesuit general, both in Rome, they are striving day and night to reduce the whole body of our Roman Catholic population, from the bulk of whom they conceal their actual purpose, to the low and humiliating attitude of Jesuit emissaries, with no sentiments, no opinions or thoughts of their own, but the mere silent, passive, and uninquiring slaves of papal and imperial authority. So, without telling the Roman Catholics of this country, they are told to just simply obey their superiors. And without question, without equivocation, without having opinions or thoughts of their own, they simply obey, and these are the sappers and miners, the fifth column in our government. And you'll find their most effective work in Washington, D.C., and in the churches, and in the big councils of the churches, like the World Council of Churches and the National Council of Churches. You will even find their involvement in banking, education, as we've already said. After all, education is one of the most important aspects of the Jesuit order, and virtually every aspect of our society. These sappers and miners for centuries now have been sapping and mining, preparing a fifth column for the eventual overthrow of our Protestant institutions and the elevation of the papacy to a national and international, more clearly spoken, a global monarch. Now it says, after laying down the foregoing general propositions based upon the teachings of the quote-unquote holy doctor and angel of the schools, as Thomas Aquinas is called, the historian Balmus, guided by the same authority, proceeds to explain the circumstances which justify resistance to the civil authority of governments. In order to make himself explicit upon this important subject, he designates a class of governments which he calls de facto, that is, such as are formed by revolution, as was the United States, against legitimate authority, and are able to maintain their existence against all opposition, like that of the United States. So the United States of America, from the Vatican's point of view, is a de facto government. It is a government in fact, but that does not make it legitimate. See what I'm saying? The definition of a de facto government, according to papal definition and use, is a government in fact, a government that has been established by illegal means, contrary to the assignation of the papacy. See, the papacy claims by divine right and by Roman Catholic canon law the power to seat and to unseat kings. In other words, he controls all governments. But the United States was a government that arose out of what the Vatican calls a revolution. And it has been a government in fact in this country since the founding of the United States, but it is a de facto government and may be overthrown at any time. He says these, according to him, have no right to exact obedience to their civil authority or laws, merely because of the fact of their existence. In other words, a de facto government has no right to swear anyone to its allegiance or force them to obey any of its laws. Okay? This is Vatican-sponsored lawlessness. This is taught in the parochial schools. This is taught in the Jesuit universities in this country. The Jesuit universities that produce the members of our Congress and our Supreme Court and our presidency. He says, not having been founded upon the principles of divine law as defined by the infallible popes, and consequently not being de jure, so now you know what a de jure government is, one that was founded upon the principles of the divine law as the Pope sees it, okay? That's a de jure government. In other words, a government seated by the papacy is a de jure government. And one not seated by the papacy is a de facto government that may be overthrown at any time, by any means, fair or foul. Again, he says, not having been founded upon the principles of the divine law as defined by the infallible popes, and consequently not being de jure, they are to be regarded as illegitimate, and on that account, no obligation of obedience to them, insofar as they violate the divine law, can be created, even by an oath of allegiance. So what does it tell you? If this is taught in Roman Catholic churches, Roman Catholic schools, Jesuit universities, even one who swears an allegiance, a Roman Catholic who swears allegiance to the country, to the flag, as it were, of the United States, is under no obligation to obey any of its laws because it is a de jure government, or rather, a de facto government. So they may swear falsely with a clear conscience. This is popery. This is Jesuitism. This is Antichrist. Now it says, quote, the last sentence on page 416 says, they are only to be obeyed, the laws of the nation, of a de jure nation, a de facto nation, I'll get it right eventually, they are only to be obeyed, quote, from motives of prudence, unquote, until de jure or legitimate governments can be substituted for them. How Jesuitical! That Roman Catholics are only required to obey the laws and the Constitution and the institutions of this country, on matters of prudence until such time as this government can be safely overthrown. In other words, the laws of the country are not binding upon conscience. It is not a sin to violate the laws of this country, according to Roman Catholic Church teaching, according to Jesuit teaching, according to Thomas Aquinas teaching, but that these laws may be obeyed simply as a matter of prudence until such time as those laws may be overthrown, or until the equivalent, a de jure or legitimate or papal government, can be substituted for them. In his view, a government which possesses the right to require and enforce obedience to its laws must have the legitimate authority to command. And this it cannot acquire unless it conforms to the divine law as the Pope shall define it. You see how he gets his power as King of Kings in the world? He said, quote, consummated facts, unquote, that is, the actual existence of an independent de facto government, cannot confer this right, no matter how well or permanently established it may be. The period of its duration, whether long or short, is of no consequence, for by the canon law of the Roman Catholic Church, the doctrine of prescription, no length of time can be set up against the Roman Catholic Church or the Pope. So this is a matter of Roman Catholic canon law under the definition of prescription, that no length of time, no matter how long the United States and its Constitution have been in existence, it is de facto, and it may not set itself up against the Church or the Pope. So embodied in Roman Catholic canon law is the justification for the overthrow of our Constitution and Bill of Rights and our entire form of government. A government of, by, and for the people is to be changed to a government of, by, and for the Pope, the biblical, historical, and prophetic Antichrist of the Bible. That's what Roman Catholic canon law represents. That's what Thomas Aquinas represents. That's what that's what Jesuitism represents. That's what the papacy represents. And it's up to the Protestants of this country to know this, to learn it, and to educate everyone within the sound of their voice before it's too late. We've come up on the break. We'll be back after the messages. You're listening to Inquisition Update on FirstAmendmentRadio.com. We'll return to Footprints of the Jesuits right after the break. Stay tuned.
$100 days, 100 subscribers at $7 will bring FirstAmendmentRadio.com to the minimum level necessary to sustain it through 2015. Go to support.FirstAmendmentRadio.com. $7 a month. Really, you can afford that for our Protestant First Amendment rights and the gospel of the kingdom message. Where your heart is, there will your treasure be also. Go to support.FirstAmendmentRadio.com.
Record budget deficits, bankruptcies galore, and the U.S. dollar is at an all-time low. With today's gloomy economic outlook, safe investments are often hard to find. For over a decade, Melody Cedarstrom at Discount Gold and Silver Trading Company has been helping people secure their future by investing in the precious metals. Melody has the honesty, integrity, and experience that is often lacking in the precious metals business. Let her put it to work for you. Call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 800-375-4188. That's 800-375-4188.
The program you are listening to is 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights Media channel. You will notice that there are few commercials on this radio network. There's a good reason for that. Corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on Internet or our several affiliates. If you benefit by the educational law programs, we ask you to give. If you are admonished or nurtured by the Bible and ministry programs, we ask you to give. If some voice a cause that you are passionate about, we ask you to give. If you believe in any of these, we ask you to support them as you would a missionary on a continual basis, as if giving a tithe for missionary radio. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause of truth. Look for the button to sponsor your favorite programs at our listen and schedule pages on the Internet. Then, when you subscribe, we will send you the last quarterly MP3 CD of that program immediately, and continue to do so with each new quarter. We will also give you unlimited archive access to all of our programs. We're asking you to give much less than a tithe, so that you may also send support directly to a particular program host, cause, and anywhere else the Spirit may lead you. Do all to the glory of our God and Creator, for His holy nation, the only kingdom that will last forever. Thank you for listening.
Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Despite Nicolas Cage's promise to do his best to get Left Behind rapture answers for us, don't hold your breath. Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. If you want true Bible prophecy answers, get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. The author exposes the Latin rapture origin, the 7-year tribulation deception, true Bible revelation of Daniel's 70 weeks, the abomination of desolation, the restrainer, America in the Revelation, the image of the beast and the mark of the beast, and the truth about God's chosen people, and so much more about Bible prophecy. This book will shatter the Left Behind paradigm of future events. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
Welcome back from the break. You're listening to the second half hour of Inquisition Update on First Amendment Radio. If you value the information you get here at Inquisition Update, please support Inquisition Update by supporting First Amendment Radio, who sponsors the program. Okay. Consummated facts. What is a consummated fact? A fact of its existence, consummated by centuries of existence, legitimized by centuries of existence, peaceful existence, as in the United States, says consummated facts, that is the government of the United States, the actual existence of an independent de facto government like that of the United States cannot confer this right no matter how well and permanently established it may be. The period of its direction, whether long or short, is of no consequence according to Roman Catholic canon law, because it says, by the Roman Catholic canon law doctrine of prescription, no length of time may be set up against the Church or the Pope. The duration and the success of this government in the United States of America cannot be used as an argument to maintain itself against the papacy. In other words, the Pope says, by divine right, I declare myself the King of Kings and Lord of Lords of the United States of America, and the government of the United States will burn its Constitution, its Bill of Rights, and all of its laws, and will impose upon the people Roman Catholic canon law. The government of the United States, neither the government nor the people of the United States may insist that, no, we don't have to do that because we've been in existence for 250 years, living at peace and prosperity, and we don't need your assistance, Mr. Pope. Roman Catholic canon law doctrine of prescription says no length of time may be set up against the Church or the Pope. In other words, America does not have an argument, a legal argument to maintain its de facto status. It must be replaced with a de jure government, one established by the papacy, according to the papacy's laws, at whichever time the Pope believes is expedient, whenever it can be safely done. He says, nevertheless, as those who pay obedience to the Pope are sometimes compelled to live under the protection of what he calls de facto and not under de jure governments, he recommends Jesuitical obedience to them, although illegitimate, because, quote, resistance would be useless and, quote, would only lead to new disorders, unquote. Now, this is exactly what we learned when we read the book The Ark and the Dove by J. Moss Ives. During the colonial period, there was only one colony in all of the 13 that was Roman Catholic, Maryland. And it was an imperative taught by the Jesuits who came with those Roman Catholic pilgrims to this country not to rile up the Protestants. Why? Because they were in an extreme minority in this country. And that they were to champion, contrary to all of Roman Catholic history, that these Catholics in the Maryland colony were to champion religious liberty. That they were to respect the religious rights of the Protestants of the other 12 colonies. And that they were not to assert themselves as divine writers. They were not to invoke the papacy. They were not to invoke Roman Catholic canon law. In other words, they literally uncatholicized themselves, but only as a matter of expediency. They were following the doctrines and teachings of this so-called holy doctor, Thomas Aquinas, biding their time ever since then for the eventual overthrow of this de facto government to put in its place a de jure or papal government. That's been the strategy of the Roman Catholics of this country ever since the Revolutionary War, ever since the colonial period. Sappers and miners among us. That's what they've been. Of course, they've never been told the strategy or the purpose. They're just told, obey your superiors. And without any purposeful intent on their part in many cases, rather even in most cases. They were simply doing what they were told to do as a matter of religious faith. At first, simply biding their time, extending a hand of conciliation to the Protestants, but secretly growing in strength and power and influence until such time as they could overthrow this de facto government. Now, it must be observed, however, that this obedience involves policy and expediency merely, and not the obligation of duty. So the Roman Catholics have been abiding by the laws of this country as a matter of expediency, not of religious duty or obligation or morality. Steadily growing in our midst ever since the colonial period has been an ever-growing, ever-crafty, ever-expedient, ever-self-serving fifth column. Ignorance in most cases, ignorant about it in most cases, but nonetheless, sappers and miners, a fifth column within our nation. together with a governing hierarchy of priests and cardinals and bishops, a veritable shadow government. Two nations living at peace within this country, both considering themselves Christian, but one dedicated to the overthrow of the other. Or rather, more correctly, as history insists, for the annihilation of the other. It is only to be yielded when unavoidable, in consequence of the fact that the illegitimate authority is too strong and well established to be overcome. Okay? This is Thomas Aquinas has taught Roman Catholics that they must yield to this illegitimate authority, this de facto government, this Protestant government, because it is too strong and well established to be overcome. But if there ever comes a time when it may be safely overcome, then it becomes a moral, spiritual, religious imperative that they do so, to establish a de jure government in place of the de facto. He says it would be otherwise if it were too feeble to defend itself against aggression, and to enforce these doctrines and principles more thoroughly as religious dogmas. He states the fact that when the Archbishop of Palmyra wrote a book to prove, quote, that the mere fact of a government's existence is sufficient to enforcing the obedience of its subjects, unquote, the, quote, work was forbidden at Rome, unquote, and placed, of course, upon the prohibitory index. In other words, the list of prohibited books. There was a Roman Catholic Archbishop of Palmyra who wrote a book saying that a de jure government must be obeyed by its subjects, clearly contradicting Roman Catholic canon law, clearly contradicting Thomas Aquinas and the Jesuits and the popes. And the Pope immediately put it on the list of prohibited books. Catholics were not allowed to read that book. Now, he says he refers very sparingly to the methods of resisting illegitimate or de facto governments. As the exponent of doctrines approved by the Jesuits, the infallibility of the Pope was accepted by him as the doctrine of the Church, although it had never been so decreed or accepted by the whole Church. This was necessary to his main premise, which was that as the Pope represented God on earth, all the power of the Church must, from necessity, be centered in him, so that whatsoever he declared the divine law to be must be assented to as such by all the faithful. If the Pope possessed that power then, he possessed it more emphatically now, since his infallibility has been made a part of the faith, and therefore all who accept that doctrine are bound to do whatsoever he shall command with reference to submitting to or resisting the constitutions and laws of civil governments, whensoever his jurisdiction, as he defines it, shall be invaded by them. Consequently, the true church teaching is that the Pope alone is permitted, as the sole earthly interpreter of divine law, to decide whether governments are de jure or de facto, and what constitutions and laws are to be obeyed or disobeyed, and no appeal is allowed from his decision. So tonight, when you're sitting in front of the Cyclops on the wall, and you see the talking heads talking about de jure and de facto governments, you know what they mean. A de jure government is one appointed by the papacy and supported by the papacy, and is cooperative with the papacy. And a de facto government is, well, de facto. It's in place, it exists in fact, but it does not have the blessing of the God of gods in the world, the Pope of Rome. And it's just on the list of the ones to be eventually overthrown. Be interesting if one of those talking heads one time would ask a Roman Catholic patriarch, an oracle from the Roman Catholic Church if he considered the United States to be a de jure or a de facto government, but I'm sure it would never be aired. Anyway, it says, with this final arbiter of the fate and the destiny of nations constantly present to guide the faithful, through the agency of a vigilant and watchful Roman Catholic hierarchy, the shadow government, the teachings of Thomas Aquinas, the Jesuits, and diverse popes, they are required to cultivate with the utmost diligence the habit of obedience to papal authority so as to keep themselves in constant preparation for future emergencies. Sounds like a fifth column to me, doesn't it to you? Pretty plain language. It says, with this final arbiter of the fate and destiny of nations constantly present to guide the faithful, that is, Roman Catholics, through the agency of a vigilant and watchful Roman Catholic priestly hierarchy, the teachings of Thomas Aquinas, the Jesuits, and diverse popes, they are required to cultivate with the utmost diligence the habit of obedience to papal authority so as to keep themselves in constant preparation for future emergencies. Would you consider the United States in a state of emergency right now? I would. And what role do you think this fifth column is going to take now that this emergency has conveniently appeared at this time? Whenever the word comes down from Rome, whether secretly or on the mainstream media news, they're ready to overthrow our government. They've already overthrown our government. I insist the only thing left to do, from their point of view, is to begin burning heretics. And they already started that. I believe that's exactly what Waco was. It was a shot over the bow of recalcitrant Protestants that have not yet joined the ecumenical movement. This is what's going to happen to you if you take the course that David Koresh has taken and separate yourselves from the government, make Christ your king, and live separate in the world like the Bible says we are to live. Separate and unspotted from the world. You know, God intended for His people to be a light unto the nations. And how can they be a light to the nations? How can they be even a light to this nation if they are in bed with the world? Does not the Bible say that we are to be separate? Now, there may be legitimate complaints against David Koresh and what he taught and those people, but they had a right to separate themselves. Now, despite whatever personal feelings you had for David Koresh and those people down there. And I would suggest that you be careful and not believe all of the nonsense that was told about that group. They had a right to separate themselves from what they believed was a wicked government and seek to live under God's law, which is exactly what Tony Alamo Christian Ministries wanted to do. To simply work to pool their resources to promote Christ and to shun Antichrist, to warn the world about Antichrist. That's what Tony Alamo Ministries was all about. Basically the same motive behind Inquisition Update. But they were, in the case of Waco, they were burned in their own house. And the people of the United States quietly looked on as if, well, they must have deserved it. And the same is true of their reaction to the Inquisition against Tony Alamo Christian Ministries. Well, if the government of the United States has taken their children and put their pastor in prison and now selling off all their assets, confiscating all of their goods and forcing those people out of the church and out of their homes and stripping them of their earthly possessions, putting them out on the street, well, they must have deserved it. I abhor that kind of attitude, especially in light of what we know now to be the truth from reading two books by R.W. Thompson, The Papacy and the Civil Power, and this one, Footprints of the Jesuits. The United States is in a state of emergency, and we know what these sappers and miners are prepared to do in a state of emergency. Just what sappers and miners do when they bring a nation to its knees and create an emergency situation, they take advantage of that for the complete overthrow. You know, I think what they're probably going to do, if they can't get the Supreme Court, the Catholics on the Supreme Court, to declare that church and state are now united, that they've misinterpreted the Constitution since the founding of the country, and want to unite church and state now, redefine the Constitution, redefine the laws of the country, and declare church and state constitutional. What they'll do is simply declare a constitutional convention. Look, there are a lot of people around this country, even Karen Hewitt is calling for a constitutional convention. And I'm telling you, the momentum is against Protestantism, and any call for a constitutional convention, any proclamation of a constitutional convention can be for no other purpose than to destroy the protections that we once had in our Constitution, completely overthrow our form of government, and to put in its place a monarchy. I don't support a constitutional convention. I support a new Protestant Reformation. That's what I support. We can't go the way of Rome. We can't be on the ecumenical yellow brick road back to Rome. And I'm just simply not going to lay down and acquiesce to a constitutional convention in the hopes that Protestants will stand up and demand liberty in Christ. I don't believe they're prepared to do that. I don't believe there's enough opposition against the ecumenical movement and the papacy in this country to even hope that that would be the case. I think the only hope left for God's people is divine intervention. And the only way we're going to secure divine intervention is if we distance ourselves hook, line, and sinker from this Vatican Jesuit-led New World Order, the ecumenical movement, the whole kit and caboodle, and separate ourselves, demanding our liberties in Christ, making Him our King, and just live with the consequences. Anyway, R.W. Thompson continues, he says, what those emergencies shall be will depend upon the progressive governments themselves, and in this country upon the people, who should not even seemingly acquiesce in any measures of either church or state, priest or layman, which shall unsettle or endanger any of the fundamental principles upon which their civil institutions are planted. And what are they planted on? Protestantism! He says there is no room in this country which can be appropriated as a burial place for popular Protestant government. But there is room for the still further outspreading of the influence of the form of government which is now sending its light over the world, advancing civilizations where it exists and creating it where it does not. Protestantism, gathering the papal doctrines from these sources, authoritatively commanded by Antichrist Pope Leo XIII to be considered as the foundation of all Roman Catholic education, a man must stultify himself not to see that the fundamental principles of our government cannot enter into and become a part of that education. You hear what R.W. Thompson's saying? No ecumenism for this country. He says the Roman Catholic youth are forbidden by the papal system from accepting as true the principles of the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution of the United States. Both of these instruments would have to be excluded from Roman Catholic schools or the Pope be disobeyed. Or if introduced there, the pupils would have to be taught that they contain irreligious, that is, non-Roman Catholic principles, which the Roman Catholic Church had always condemned and still condemns. The Jesuit preceptor, that is, the Jesuit teacher in their schools, would tell them that the American Revolution was a sin in itself because it was rebellion against the existing principles of monarchical government, that is, papal government, which alone have the divine approval. that all men are not created free and equal, because some are born to command, like the Pope and his priests, and others were born to obey, like you and me. That governments do not derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, but the multitude of the governed are bound to obey their superiors, and they, the Pope. And that when our fathers appealed to the divine providence for the support of our national independence, their appeal was blasphemous, because the Pope, who represents God on earth, has anathematized the principles they have announced. And with the Declaration of Independence thus disposed of, they will be further instructed that the first article of the amendments of the Constitution is null and void, because it is the duty of the government to establish the Roman Catholic religion by law, inasmuch as it is the only true religion ever revealed, and the Protestant religions are false and heretical. That's the destiny of the United States of America, post-Vatican Council II. You can count on it. This is what is going to befall this nation. R.W. Thompson has nailed it. Protestantism is the target, and popery is the solution. And we must fight.
Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Despite Nicolas Cage's promise to do his best to get left behind rapture answers for us, don't hold your breath. Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie, with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character, as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy, in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. If you want true Bible prophecy answers, get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. The author exposes the Latin rapture origin, the 7-year tribulation deception, true Bible revelation of Daniel's 70 weeks, the abomination of desolation, the restrainer, America in the Revelation, the image of the beast and the mark of the beast, and the truth about God's chosen people, and so much more about Bible prophecy. This book will shatter the Left Behind paradigm of future events. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.